Testing. Okay.
Just go ahead and say, hey, I'm about to get going.
Hey guys. Uh, okay. Um, so I'm Jake Hamilton. I'm a Bitcoin developer on Urbit, and I'm working on a Lightning implementation on Urbit that should be beta launched by January. So I thought I'd come and present that to you guys, talk about what Urbit is, building Bitcoin on Urbit, the Lightning implementation itself, and our roadmap for the future and why you should be interested in it. Okay, so Urbit is a clean slate computing stack and peer-to-peer network that's built for user sovereignty and permanence. So there's two components to that. One is a purely functional, strictly typed operating system. It's built from the ground up, lives on any Unix host, and then there's the peer-to-peer network, encrypted, that runs in between those instances of the operating system with human-readable, Sybil-resistant identities on the P2P network. There's also a growing ecosystem of completely user-owned applications that runs inside the operating system and, communicates over the network. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so it's quite old. It's about 20 years old at this point. Development started in 2002. It went into public development in 2011. And then finally, about 2.5 years ago, OS1, which was the first graphical interface to a chat, groups, and publishing flagship app, was released. And, okay. So, starting with the operating system. So this is built from the ground up, right? It's a deterministic virtual machine executing a purely functional machine code called Nock. A programming language built on top of that called Hoon that's purely functional, strictly typed, and has a self-hosted Nock compiler. So the reason that written in Hoon is the microkernel, so it's about 30,000 lines of code. It has typed interprocess communication, and that 30,000 lines is a full set of kernel modules. So it has a version file system, its own build system, networking, secret store, timer, web server, all of that in under 30,000 lines. And so this is Yeah, so this is made to be permanent, simple, easy to understand, and extremely compact. This is something that an average dev can understand from top to bottom, all the way through, control and tinker with themselves, and something that will become permanent over time. So for example, Urbit is Kelvin versioned, which means the version numbers go down, not up. And when the version number gets to 0, that's it. Urbit is never, ever going to change again in any way, much like Bitcoin. So it's made to be a computer that you can pass down to your kids, right? And that they can completely understand and control all of the data, all of the computation that's happening on it, as well as the identity they have on the network of these nodes. So speaking of that network, so the Urbit network, the kernel module that handles networking is called AIMS. It builds in end-to-end encryption between peers, as well as exactly once message delivery, which is really helpful for Lightning, and NAT traversal. Identities or network addresses on this are human readable. There's an example over there. That's me, Tonda Sitrime, and that sigil there is also a programmatic interpretation of the underlying network address. So as far as I know, there is not like a QR code style reading app like on mobile that uses these, but you could. That translates directly. You could send me a message on the Urbit network using that. So these are linked to BIP32 extended public keys. And over this network, you can do over-the-air software distribution and upgrades. So like installing an app written by another user is as easy as just like searching them and seeing what apps they advertise themselves as distributing. Click, install, that's it. Sorry. Okay, yeah. So size of the network, so right now there's about 10,000 booted nodes. Of those, 1 to 2,000 are on at any given time over the day. And there are at least 50 apps being distributed that do, like I said, publishing, chat, groups. There's poker, chess, data backups. There's, so PALS is an important one. It's a social graph between Urbit planets, so like, you know, your friends and friends of friends. There's a gossip protocol built on top of that social graph that I'll be implementing or leveraging in the implementation of Lightning. So there's a lot of stuff I say question because, you know, there is no overview of this network. It is uncensorable, it can't be shut down, no one has any idea what's happening on the entire thing. So I don't know how many there are. I just know for sure about 50 plus. So why do Bitcoin on this, like extremely novel computing stack? So there's two big problems that we're solving here, or trying to solve. One of them is off-chain protocol coordination. So whether it's like Lightning, RGB, Taro, DLCs, or even just vanilla multisigs, you need off-chain messaging and validation in order to execute these protocols. Right now, that's happening in a wide range of implementation languages and environments, and that's a problem both for pace of development and like duplication of effort, as well as like security and operational uptime. Which we saw a few weeks ago, the entire Lightning network was shut down because a conflict between the Bitcoin D parsing libraries used by BCTD and LND allowed someone to introduce an exploit that shut down the entire network. And this is a great example. It's also a big problem for UX, right? So, right now we do a lot of copy pasting and scanning of node IDs, payrecs, invoices, addresses, right? And the more off-chain protocols we have, the more multiplication of this kind of UX we're going to get. It'll get more and more unmanageable. The other is ecosystem integration with other apps. So for like a total example of this, say I want to open a DLC with some of my friends that commits to something. I want to bet on, a horse race, presidential election, something like that, right? I want to put that bet like into a group chat or onto Twitter, say. So instead of like a Twitter poll or survey, sorry, this thing is super sensitive. So instead of a Twitter survey, instead like I tweet out a bet that people who follow me or people that I follow can place their bet on. And I also would like the expiration for that DLC to show up in my calendar. Like this is when to go and check and see whether I like made money or lost it on the DLC. And I want to pay for all of this over Lightning. That would be somewhere between extremely difficult and impossible to do today. So pairing together even, Twitter and Google Calendar or something like that is something that's like a startup does this, like kind of levels of integration between the centralized apps that we have. Some of them it's just not possible. Like Twitter famously has an extremely locked down API. Centralized entities own all of this data. Even when they do make it theoretically possible to integrate them together, they have different data models, different API formats. This is an extremely non-trivial process, never mind trying to integrate off-chain Bitcoin protocols into it to do things like that. But on Urbit, you can do this. This is entirely possible. So like I mentioned, that social graph application, pals, groups, you can plug those directly into any other app that's operating on your node, on your Urbit. And they have a shared data model, shared API format and typing, and makes it very easy to implement those kinds of integrations so that we can actually use Lightning for the kind of micropayment use cases that we think are cool without needing a company for every bespoke integration. So, current state of Bitcoin on Urbit, the Bitcoin wallet ships with Urbit OS since early last year. So in interfaces with Bitcoin D or BTCD full nodes, that can be one that you run locally on the same host as your Urbit, or it can be one, you can access it over the Urbit network. So you just need to have some Urbit peer who is running a Bitcoin full node. And then as soon as that wallet was released, we started on Lightning implementation. It's about 18 months ago. And it is about 90% done. I expect to beta release it by the end of this year, December, January. So let's talk a little bit about that implementation. So the architecture of Volt is the Lightning implementation on Urbit. Its architecture is that it has two components. These are agents, which are similar to like daemons in other systems. They're basically like a state machine with an ACID database that's network addressable by my peers. There are two. The primary one, as you might think, is Volt. So that handles channels between Urbit peers, payments over those channels, generation of invoices. It implements like most of the Bolt spec. I sort of mentioned that it implements 2, 3, 5, and 11, which deal with like the peer protocol, on-chain transactions, and invoice generation. Because what's not in there is Bolts 1, 8, or 10 that deal with networking, messaging connection establishment, DNS, transport layer. All of that is already handled by Urbit, which is why it's possible. So when I said we started development on this 18 months ago, I mean, that's been 1 to 2 part-time people working around full-time jobs. We're able to get a Lightning implementation almost out the door in about 1.5 years. So that's like the increased pace of development that's possible when you have these things already handled for you. So the other component of the system is Volt Provider. So like Volt can do intra-Urbit Lightning connections, right? Can handle all of that. But in order to transact with the external Lightning network, because we're not dealing with Lightning's messaging protocol and transport layer, we need some kind of gateway. And Volt Provider is that gateway. So Volt Provider, everyone who is running Lightning on Urbit runs Volt. Some people run Volt Provider and are also running LND on the machine that is hosting their Urbit. So here's an example of that architecture. Yeah. So here we see like different ships on the Urbit network, different Urbits. Massive Hodler and Hodler Hodlin are actually valid human readable identities on Urbit. I know Hodler Hodlin. So Volt allows you to open these people to open channels in between. There's me, Tonda Sitrime. I'm also running Volt Provider on my ship and LND on the host machine. And so Volt Provider talks to LND over RPC. And so a payment originates, from here, bounces through my ship. I pass it over Volt Provider and inject it into LND, and then out into the network in order to pay someone who is not on Urbit but is using Lightning, or to be paid. And so LND has an RPC method for intercepting HTLCs that are in flight and destined for something I know about through route hints, and that's what we're leveraging in order to communicate between Volt Provider and LND this way. Yeah, so the current state, released by January. The last things I'm working on is just the penalty workflow, so monitoring for revoked commitment transactions and then sweeping them. And that should be done quite soon, and we'll have something that's in beta. And I say it's in beta because the further work that needs to be done is onion routing. So right now, Volt Provider nodes can see the entire payment flow coming from interior nodes that in and out of the external network. But that doesn't prevent using it in a secure way. It's just a privacy issue. So I kind of boxed that into a separate phase of work that's going to follow this one. That'll be implementing variants on bolts 4 and 7 and making a PR to LND to be able to inject payment preimages or hash preimages into a different context, which it doesn't currently do and would be required for this. There's also discovery, so I'll be leveraging that Urbit social graph PALs in order to do discovery of gateway, Volt Provider running peers, as well as channel announcements, all of that, because there's already a gossip protocol built on top of that. And that's the work of a few months, compared to a much longer development cycle outside of Urbit. Okay, so just getting back to so why are we doing all this, right? Because I have to, make a PR to LND, have them implement something new in order to manage this kind of gateway crossing between two different otherwise partitioned types of Lightning network. So why go about doing all of this? This is because I can integrate everything else on Urbit. All the things that we're doing, we've got calendar, chat, groups, the social graph that is self-owned by users. That's not something that Twitter or Facebook owns. That's something that's hosted on your machine and your friends. All of that can be leveraged through a common interface much faster. So integrating this Lightning implementation with so creating subscription publishing using our existing groups interface, I expect to take about a month. At which point we'll basically have Lightning Substack, and that's just something that can be done out of the box, right? I don't need to get API keys and learn a new data model and interface and so on in order to do that on some other thing. I can do that natively as a plugin very easily to the groups app that we have, as well as poker betting with Lightning and other integrations. So we'll talk about the advantages of using these apps and of building Lightning applications on Urbit, and really should put L in parentheses because the apps that are on Urbit can be made into Lightning apps immediately, or more or less immediately, and with a great deal of ease. So they are all interoperable, like I said. They share a common typed API format and data model, and they're network addressable, meaning that you don't have to worry about what port your particular application is available on. You just send a message to another ship that is a poke to an app on that address in the network. You poke it by name, and that command or that data gets to that app. The operating system handles it automatically. So networking, identity, access. So logging into this, you don't need to re-roll authentication. You just log in as your Urbit address. If I'm in chat, for example, or if I'm in say a one-to-one chat with someone, chat already knows who that person is and can pass that same identity over to Volt. Volt knows about that kind of network relationship. So I don't need to get in chat the node ID of the person that I'm talking to and then pass it over. I can just say, I want to make a payment to this person. that chat application tells Volt, and then Volt then handles sending an invoice to that ship. It already knows who to send the invoice to and for how much, and can handle the entire payment process, and all I see is done, like in my chat application. So the other thing is distribution and upgrades over the air. So currently the process of building LMD, if you're technical, is reasonably easy. But if you're not technical, is not at all for the most part. Here, anyone can install Volt just by in the command line, because there's a terminal driver as well as part of the operating system. You can just type bar install Tonda sitrime Volt, and that's it. Boom, you're done. You have a fully configured Volt node, and you just need to open channels to people that you know. No port configuration and access policy and so on required. You can also issue upgrades over the air, so seamless upgrades, and they're deterministic as well. So if there's any problem in the upgraded state, it just fails, and you keep the app that you have, so you're not vulnerable to breaking updates being pushed by an app developer. So for a developer, that's it's minimal DevOps, minimal configuration and maintenance compared to the existing stack. Apps come with databases. Builds are reproducible on all clients because of the functional and type nature of the operating system and the consistency of the environment. So you don't need to create multiple builds for multiple types of machines that might be running this thing. There aren't different paths. It's that simple. It just works. And through this interoperation, we can get rid of all of the copy pasting and the scanning of different kinds of information, the terrible clunky UX that we have today in terms of making Lightning micropayments interoperate with anything else that we might feel like doing that with. So that's a huge advantage. Your development cycle and your UX are out the gate, I think 10x better doing this on Urbit compared to the traditional tech stack. Higher level, the reasons to solve these problems using Urbit as opposed to anything else is that they have a common philosophy. So there's self-sovereignty. So the whole idea is that today, Twitter owns my social graph, Google owns my identity, everyone but me owns my data. Anything that I do lives somewhere else, is data mined by intelligence agencies and advertising companies and so on. And I don't own most of the software that I use. I don't understand it. Right? Unix is beyond pretty much any dev other than Linus possibly to understand the entire thing top to bottom. So there's epistemic sovereignty is relevant here as well. That this is something that's actually feasible for a single person to modify and understand. And this is, so you have owning your own identity, owning your own computation and your own data, as well as your own money, is essential to sovereignty. And then there's long-termism, like I mentioned with the Kelvin versioning. This thing is meant to stop changing at a certain point in probably the next 5 to 10 years. And for this to be something that you can hand down to your children and it will never break. It is meant to do everything that it needs to do. You can extend it in any way you need to without any global level changes to the software. The forever computer, just much the same Bitcoin ethos as Bitcoin, forever money and forever value. And decentralization, which is an aspect of self-sovereignty, but what's important separately is that, this network can't be shut down. No one can censor applications that are being distributed or communications that are happening over it. This is something that, unlike a lot of applications, certainly the ones that are centralized, Twitter can ban you, Google can delete you, anything, but individual companies too. It can be made very difficult to distribute your application or to communicate, and Urbit is made for that not to be possible. So sound personal computing is how I think of Urbit, and sound digital money needs sound personal computing and vice versa in order to actually achieve sovereignty and the long-term vision. So the roadmap for stuff that comes after the release in January. The next thing up, besides the Lightning implementation itself, is submarine swaps for inbound liquidity for merchants. I'm going to be implementing a version of the PeerSwap protocol in order to do that, and coordinate submarine swaps on the Urbit network, as well as falling back to the Loop marketplace and other kinds of providers. Those integrations that I mentioned, so subscription, Substack style subscription publishing using Lightning inside of our existing publishing and chat apps, as well as social payments to people that you know on Pals, and using Pals for Lightning purposes to gossip out channel announcements and find providers and so on. And then, like I mentioned, implementing versions of Bolts 4 and 7, and then having what I would call a full production non-beta Lightning implementation running. So past that, I don't say 2024 because I think all of those things together will probably take 6 months or so, which then leaves the rest of the year. The next big thing I want to tackle is Taro. So Taro is another one of these things that has a lot of client-side validation, it has external messaging, it has universes, which are off-chain repositories of the information needed to validate assets. And I want to implement that stuff on Urbit. And on Urbit, what I'm more interested in initially than fungible tokens is non-fungible assets using Taro, and using those to anchor rights, permissions, credentials, and reputation. And so adding those on to the Urbit identity that we have so that you can gate access to a group, you can pass the moderator torch so that an organizer or an organization can allocate permissions and responsibilities for different things in a way that's decentralized and transferable. The Bitcoin wallet itself needs some improvements that I think that needs to be done as at least alongside anything bigger like Taro that we're engaged in, just for like safety and functionality. It needs multi-sig and Taproot support. It predates Taproot and is not a full like BIP 157, 158 like client, and I think that needs to get done as well. And then I'm also excited about the use cases for DLCs. Like I really want to run a proper assassination market, possibly on Urbit, so that's up there as well. Yeah, so if you're a dev who just finds this to be an interesting proposal, there are a lot of devs and learning resources out there for Urbit, like more than you would think given its weirdness. So that's totally a doable thing. I say coming very soon on the website because like the PR for the website was supposed to be merged today, and it's actually going to be like tomorrow. So just visit the website tomorrow instead of tonight. You can join the network. So the urbit.org has all the more information than I gave you, as well as pathways to getting started. That's both like if you want to do a self-hosted Urbit or if you want to use a hosting service, those exist as well. And you can get in touch. I'm on all of the things: email, Twitter, Telegram. If you don't like those for some reason, come and talk to me. And if you get on the network, I'm Tonda Sitrime, and there's also an Urbitcoiners group hosted by my friend Pindet Timit. Thanks, guys. Go ahead.
I've been trying to sort of wrap my head around differences between various personal or sovereign computing proposals that are being worked on. So I guess ones that come to mind are Urbit, Start9, and things like Umbrel, et cetera, as well as Hole Punch, and this idea of talking peer-to-peer and grabbing data peer-to-peer between two regular computers. I don't know if you've thought about those, but if you have, do you have thoughts about how you might compare those as solutions?
So I think like Umbrel is certainly complementary. Interestingly, the only people, or almost the only people who have known what Urbit is at this conference so far have been people who operate Lightning nodes on Umbrel, and so because Umbrel has an Urbit plugin or app on it, and so I mean that's a solution for. I think that is a solution that eventually, when Urbit can run on bare metal and not just on a Unix host, could like merge or supplant or something. But for now, Urbit is an overlay operating system, not something that runs on the metal. So you need a hardware solution. And obviously for Lightning, we're also wanting to like co-locate full nodes, Lightning nodes, and so on. And so I think it's really nice to have a kind of open access sovereign hardware solution where we can put those things together in a clean way. I don't know anything about Hole Punch personally, so I couldn't necessarily speak to that. Yeah.
Another random, I heard an interview with, I forget the guy's name, who started Ukbar, which is like an Urbit-based, I think, Ethereum payment solution. Is that right?
Yeah, it's so it's like a ZK rollup. It's actually running as like an L3 on top of Starknet, on top of Ethereum, because ZK rollups, you can do this like fractal inclusion of one in the next. Yeah, that was Tim Luckmiptov, friend of mine. Yeah.
He seems to feel that there are things that can be accomplished with Urbit and Ethereum that can't with Bitcoin, and I was wondering, obviously you're not following that path, so what your thought process is?
So I mean, the things that can't be accomplished are the things that are not specific to Urbit, right? They're the same things that like Bitcoin, has been hard to accomplish has been hard to accomplish on Bitcoin already. You know, dealing with like arbitrary settlement, Turing complete smart contracts, all of that. So like, don't want to like speak ill of another project too much or like go into it. I mean, you know, I'm a Bitcoin maxi. I think that, you know, long term, the addition of covenants, of like recursive covenants to Bitcoin will enable pretty much all of the functionality that you actually need. And that I think is Yudi who said, like, it's a lot easier for Bitcoin to add the functionality that it needs over time as it's well tested than it is for ETH to take JPEGs off the base layer and stop being like 5 terabytes in size for the chain, and with all the centralizing pressures that are also largely irreversible. They're kind of like network effect dark pattern that causes. And so, you know, when I look at like 40% of the Ethereum stake being controlled by US entities and like a small group of devs who are able to basically like arbitrarily change the network, to the cheering applause of most of the users, true, but like, you know, I don't see a properly decentralized ecosystem. And so, you know, given that there's a ton that we can do with Taproot, a ton that we can do with Lightning, and that, you know, Lightning, as far as the use cases that ordinary people around the world need, is still the one leading the charge. You know, I'm happier to be doing incremental work on Bitcoin, and then, you know, hopefully in a few years we see something where you're like, ZK rollups are really cool technology, like super, super cool. It is something that is doable on Bitcoin. There's at least one proposal out there for how that involves like a proof verification opcode and recursive covenants. So like hopefully something like that will happen. I think it will. Increased functionality will happen. In the meantime, I feel like I've got 3 years of stuff on my plate to work on until we have covenants.
Yeah, can you just talk a little bit more about the state of the ecosystem right now? So what are the most sort of popular applications that people are using today?
Let's see, what's going on right in this exact moment. So there's been a huge flurry of apps released just in the last like month or two since Urbit Assembly happened in September, and I'm not even like caught up on all of those apps that have come out, but I know that data backups and restoration of your Urbit, payments like a bank solution that wraps as middleware around other apps, both came from Quartus recently. So Rumors is the thing that mainly uses the Gossip protocol built on top of PALs, and it's basically just like, it's like the site of the same name from, you know, whatever it was, like a decade ago. So it's like anonymous posting that goes to your pals and the pals of your pals, and spreads through the graph that way. I mean, still, like most of the activity on the network happens in chat publishing and groups. Like, and there's quite a lot. I mean, there are people doing like turning plant bio, like life signs into music. There's a really big music and fashion scene on Urbit, which like I didn't know until earlier this year, really. But that's like a whole half of the network that I've not been on. There's a lot of people interested in decentralized science. So finding ways to like improve the process where we do clinical trials and experiments and like crowdsourcing data for those things and finding other kinds of like automated solutions. Oh, radio. That's probably like one of the cooler new apps recently where like people can queue up for like a group on the network, like the next video in a series, the next like short video in a series, and it's visible to your pals and other pals. That was something that was debuted just in the last few weeks, and everybody's been having fun with. But yeah, for the most part, like it's mostly interesting to devs, right? Like the most used things are like Discord plus blogging level functionality. But there's now 3 or 4 companies on the network that are racing to release like big integrated UIs that will combine all of this with like payments and with basically like a desktop browser environment. And all of that, I think the first alpha of one of those is supposed to be in the next month as well. So there's a lot of development work happening, and I think the answer will be very different in 6 months from what it is now.
Last question, we gotta wrap it up. Here you go.
So, if I'm coming from Ubuntu, how challenging would this be to? I mean, is it command line right now only? That's what it sounds like. And like,
No.
what is it? How foreign is it?
Hold on. Sorry, I'm just. Oh, fuck it. Maybe I'm not connected to the internet. Sorry. Just trying to show you. Like I can just log in and show it to you. Why am I not? Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Absolutely. It is so. From a user perspective, like no, it is not only command line. Like there is a full graphical interface. When I talk about like chat and groups and stuff, like I mean there is what kind of looks like an app store is what you log into with your ID. And then the one what ships with the operating system is like the Groups app, which does publishing and chat and so on, and the Bitcoin wallet. So from a user perspective, it's like pretty easy to use. There are hosting services that like, so you don't have to do any of the stuff involved in setting it up, which is really as simple as like downloading the binary, getting an ID, and booting the binary with the ID anyway. So if you can use the command line at all, you don't need the hosting service. As a dev, we've gone from there being maybe a couple of dozen Hoon developers. Hoon is the programming language that the kernel and the apps are written in. We've gone from having a couple of dozen to there now being over 300 who have gone through the app development school over the last like less than a year. I find it really, the learning curve is like straight up a little bit and then pretty much flat. Like, I mean, I had no experience with functional programming languages before. I was not like a Haskeller or something, and Hoon was my first exposure to that, which is very different from working in JavaScript, which is like my previous experience. And it took me like a month to release like a simple app that implemented my own like toy gossip protocol and could do a couple of things on the network. And Hoon is really, it's something, 90% of the time if your code compiles, it works, which is completely different from working in JavaScript or in the existing stack. And I love that, like that's great. Yeah.
All right,
Okay,
give him another
thanks,
round
guys.
of applause.